between males and females would be one question I have. And then the second question I have is, I guess the demand effect you're arguing here will be triggered or induced by the presence of eye image. But this is a between subject design. I mean, one could argue that the EDE is relatively weaker under a between subject design. So, I mean, I just find that argument a little bit not as compelling. Maybe you could do something to test that, run further sessions or something to actually test for the presence of the experimental demand effect, given that this is one of your conjectures for the results.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if we can actually test the experimental demand effect separately, that would be nice. But we are not really sure how. Yeah. So if you have any thoughts on how we can test it, yeah, I'd be happy to know it. And
well, there was that paper that came out last year, I think. I'm trying to remember the authors' names, but they have this paper on bounding experimental demand effects, where they basically ask subjects to do a certain action, and then they observe compliance. De Quit. And then they sort of use that as a potential maximum experimental demand effect that they would observe in the regular treatment.
Okay. So I think, I will have a look at that paper. Thank you. Thanks for your suggestion.
Yep. Thanks, Jiyoung.
Thanks.
Sorry, it still feels weird clapping myself, but
don't worry, I will clap for you.
Okay.
Stephen, when you're ready, please go ahead.
Yep. Yeah, I'm trying to share my screen at the moment.
Yeah, I can see yours, Stephen.
Oh, okay, good. So I can't see my own yet because my computer's being real slow. So just a minute or so. Oh, okay, yeah. So now it looks like I've got it up. So thanks everyone for listening in. As you may have clocked, I am not Patricia. She unfortunately was unable to attend today. Apparently she's been in an accident, and I really hope she's doing okay. So I've switched mine to this spot. And this is joint work with Marina De La Justa, who is also a professor at the University of Reading and is in attendance. But all of the mistakes I take responsibility for. What we've done in this paper is to, in sort of two parts, document the literature on unconscious bias and relate it to how we think about discrimination within economics, as well as how psychologists think about discrimination, because they don't quite line up that well. And then we move into an application of revealing gender bias to a group of undergraduate students in order to assess the prospect for using revelation of this unconscious bias as a potential manipulation for getting people to be less motivated by, or at least less driven by, not necessarily motivated, since these are unconscious, their implicit gender biases, and to potentially counteract those biases. So what we find is that the prospects for this are limited, and in fact, we find that female undergraduate students are the only ones who respond in any way to information about these unconscious gender biases. And so our conclusion, which we'll sort of get into, in more depth, is that there's a potential real limited scope for just using revelation of bias as a treatment for inducing greater levels of gender equality. So to just sort of go over the structure of the talk, I'll first talk about discrimination within economics, how we think about that, and how that might be related to unconscious biases. And then move on to how those manifest, particularly with respect to the social category of gender. Talk a little bit about how exposure to different environmental factors impacts this bias, as well as being exposed to the information that that you yourself might carry these biases, what they are, and how you might correct them. And then we'll conclude with an experiment that we ran last year among undergraduate students at the University of Reading, where we experimentally revealed to some participants in the experiment what their gender bias was, and then potentially observed them in an effort to correct their gender bias, as well as looking at potential licensing or reinforcing behavior, which is done sort of as a very nice environmental observation of how sort of really well they've potentially overcome or not overcome their gender biases. So the discrimination literature within economics is very far removed from the idea of implicit biases. That is, economics typically sees human behavior as very rational, and in fact, people know their own preferences perfectly well. People know the preferences and beliefs of others relatively well, but discrimination might just arise from an absence of perfect information, right? So if there's an asymmetry of information, then the idea, which was proposed by Arrow and Phelps, called statistical discrimination, is that discrimination is really just about using the social category of an individual, given that you don't know exactly what that individual's characteristics are because you haven't met them. It's private information, but you know things about, on average, what the characteristics of people in that individual social category is, right? So you might think about the prevalence of human capital investments, so degree qualifications of the individual social category. You might think about labor market attachment characteristics of that individual social category. So, for example, I'll get to Becker in the next bullet point. So if you think about labor market attachment for women, you don't necessarily know one female worker's intentions about moving forward with a firm or staying in the labor market, but you know, in general, the average labor market attachment for women who give birth, for example, and you would use that to inform your judgment about how to treat the worker. The other way that economists can typically accommodate discrimination within a very rational choice framework is to simply ascribe it to preferences. So this is the Becker theory, that there are either employers or employees who have a taste for interacting with people of a particular social category. So a taste for not hiring minority ethnicities, a taste for maintaining a gender segregated workplace, and the implications of these two different theories for the economic outcomes, for the potential policy remedies that you would want to use are slightly different, but basically statistical discrimination says that you want to basically have more information and just more information about specific people, is going to improve the efficiency of matching and the market. With taste-based discrimination, the policy remedy is basically that you want to encourage more competition, because those who carry that taste with them into the marketplace, if they face enough competition, will eventually be competed out by the people who don't have the taste for discrimination if profitability depends on productivity alone and not this taste for maintaining discrimination. I think the literature, at least in certain subspecialties, has moved on from these two very stark, very rational explanation for discrimination within economics, and they've been extended in essentially the ways that we would think about behavioral economics having extended preferences in general. So one is to think about how belief formation over time, so people who don't necessarily know their own characteristics, updating beliefs about themselves, can be exposed to the beliefs of others in the marketplace and internalize those beliefs. So that's the model of Oxoby, that people might not sort of invest in their own human capital if they perceive discrimination within the marketplace, either because they think their talents are not going to be adequately discovered, or they sort of underestimate their own talents because they're using information from these stereotypes. And what this can generate is some self-fulfilling equilibria, which maintain these stereotypes based on race or gender, even though those equilibria are not necessary. That is, you could potentially disturb those equilibria to arrive at more efficient and more equitable solutions. And there's a pretty large body of evidence to show that people do face discrimination in a number of outcomes. That is, discrimination has not gone away with greater access to information, for example, about credit scores, nor has it gone away over time just because we operate in a competitive market economy. That is, women, ethnic and racial minorities face worse outcomes than men and white people along a whole range of dimensions. Psychologists think about discrimination and stereotyping a little bit differently from economists because they think more in terms of the representativeness heuristic rather than a rational expectations framework that economists adhere to. So the representativeness heuristic says that if there is an attribute which is most commonly observed among a particular category, then it gets associated in people's minds with that social category, even if it's not actually something which is a rational thing to expect of someone in a Bayesian sense. So there's this classic example from Kahneman and Tversky of the bank teller who's a member of the feminist movement. They sort of construct an example where it's more likely that she's just a bank teller and might or might not be a feminist than that she is both. But this description in their study of her characteristics are highly representative of someone who is a feminist, and so they observe a lot of people sort of ascribing a high probability to her being this feminist bank teller rather than just a bank teller who may or may not be feminist. And so psychologists have a much different mechanism for how expectations get updated, and this is what we refer to when we refer to a stereotype. That is, a stereotype is not a rational expectation of someone based on their social category. A stereotype is something that is associated with a social category because it relies on the representativeness heuristic. And the reason why we do this in our minds is that it's very difficult to think about information coming in from a world which is very complex. And so stereotypes are really best thought of as cognitive shortcuts. That is, they're a system one process that forms fast associations between observable characteristics and expectations. And so because this is a system one process, it doesn't necessarily operate at the level of deliberative thinking, of conscious thought, and it's also hard to correct because these processes operate in a sort of automatic, non-thinking way. And so overcoming people's stereotypes can be a very difficult thing unless you sort of reinforce a different stereotype over a rather long period of time to unlearn it. So this is a really nice experiment that was done on the platform Stack Exchange a couple of years ago, where they had question and answers about various math problems. So these are either undergraduate students who are trying to get solutions to problems in their math modules, or just people who are curious about solving particular problems. And it allows really sort of any random participant who's a member of the platform to submit a potential solution. And they find that when they provide information about the gender of proposed solutions that are submitted to this platform, that there could be different reactions about how this information impacts people's belief about stereotypes. So it is either the case that this can reverse people's expectations about female competence at math, so it's sort of a disturbing the existing stereotype, and then you update your beliefs in a rational way, or it can, among some people, cause a disbelief in the competence of the solution, right? So because it's coming from a woman, you sort of disbelieve the solution, or you disbelieve the rating mechanism. Stereotypes are also powerful and potentially generate a large amount of economic inefficiency if people internalize those stereotypes about themselves. So the idea of stereotype threat is, it's often misunderstood, but the basic idea is that if you are sitting in an exam assessment and you don't know how well you are going to do at this assessment, you might use information such as people like you typically don't do well at this assessment to update your beliefs about yourself. And that belief updating about the self can cause a change in the rational level of effort that you might want to exert. And we know this from contest theory. That is, if you get information that you're not likely to do well, then you might decide that, yeah, I'm not going to do well, so that's just how it is. Or if you get information that someone like me can do well at this test, then you might take that information as a motivating factor. And the problem with this is that it's completely self-fulfilling expectations, and it's a bad equilibrium that these self-fulfilling expectations generate. And this sort of phenomenon operates from a very, very young age. So these sort of ideas are baked in and socialized into people starting from very early childhood. And there's a lot of evidence, particularly in terms of certain cognitive skills, such as maths and spatial skills, that are observed to be equal at very, very young ages, and then are shown to diverge as pupils are exposed over time to the idea that that boys might be better at these than girls. So that has been shown by both labor economists and psychologists. And so the idea here is that being exposed to these ideas that that your group might not be so great at this can generate an undesirable demotivating effect in various areas. And this bias is also replicated in algorithms, because algorithms learn from the existing behavior of people. And if the algorithm is just picking up on this self-generating, self-reinforcing equilibrium, then that has the potential to further reinforce the self-generating equilibrium. And so to sort of integrate how economists and psychologists think about these things, economists typically assume that people know their own abilities, people know their own biases, their own tastes, and that discrimination is really sort of either a taste-based phenomenon or an asymmetric information problem. And psychologists, on the other hand, see the belief updating process as something that is driven by heuristics, that people don't necessarily know their own abilities, people don't know their own preferences, and that bias comes in either as an overt use of these ideas about who is better at what based on the representativeness heuristic, or it's a completely automatic process that these ideas just drive behavior in a way that might not be observable to the decision maker.
Stephen, you have 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Jiyoung. So how do we observe bias is a paradigm called the implicit association test. This is the thing that we'll be using in our experiment. And what the implicit association test does is that there are two categories of words presented to subjects on the screen. Subjects have to categorize the word in the center. So you see here salary as belonging to either the career or the family category. So in this case, salary belongs to career. And so you would want to allocate that word to the left-hand column. Because there's two categories of things that need to be allocated here, you potentially also are going to get a word that's associated with a gender. So, for example, uncle might come up as the next word, and you would have to put that in the right-hand column because it's associated with male. And because stereotypes are a system one process, it's a lot easier for people to put words in a column where the column has sort of a coherent gender stereotype associated with it, rather than a case where the columns are switched and you've got to sort of work against the gender stereotype in allocating words to the columns. And the way that implicit bias is measured is in a within subject difference in how fast they can allocate the words in a congruent condition where the categories match up in terms of the gender stereotype, rather than what's called the incongruent condition, where the categories are reversed relative to the gender stereotype. So I will try and move on a little bit fast to get at what we do. So our idea is basically to look at interventions which try to overcome implicit gender bias by simply telling people that gender bias exists and revealing to them their own gender bias. And the reason why we're interested in this is that this is presented as a potentially very low-cost way to get people to be less biased. On the other hand, there's a lot of reasons to believe that that this is not going to be enough to really cause people to change their behavior, mostly because it is either the case that those biases are something that they intend to carry forward, or if it's due to moral licensing behaviors. So moral licensing would be that once you've sort of congratulated yourself for overcoming bias within a particular environment, you've given yourself moral credit and you go back to being just as biased as you were previously. Now, there's a little bit of controversy in the moral licensing literature on whether eliciting a behavior after you've done a good or a bad action is going to cause you to reverse, like so do moral licensing or moral cleansing, or whether it's going to get you to integrate that into your identity and then be consistent with it. And the takeaway from this literature is that consistency is elicited when the behavior is more abstract and is more identity relevant. So if you are told that you are an unbiased person in a very general sense, then the subsequent behavior will cause you to try and reinforce the knowledge that you're unbiased. But if it's about a specific event, right? So if it points to, okay, here was a particular instance in the recent past where you did the right thing, right? So where you were really gender conscious and dealt with your biases, then that sort of thing is potentially likely to lead to moral licensing behavior. That is, people assume that they have this credit that enables them to be more biased going forward. So our experiment consisted of an online implicit association test administered in a lecture of undergraduate students. The categories that we used were male, female, and STEM versus liberal arts, where the gender stereotype is obviously that men are better at these STEM subjects. And half of our participants were, after they did the computer-based IAT, told what their difference in reaction times was, and they were told that this difference in reaction times is used as a measure of their own gender bias, whereas the other half of participants were not informed about their own bias, but simply given the message that their difference in reaction times is recorded and that difference in reaction times is used as a measure of implicit gender bias. Participants were then, right after that, given an opportunity to redeem themselves by doing the same exact exercise but on paper, where we told subjects that we just wanted to compare the online version with the paper version. In the paper version, you just have to mark in a little column which which category the word belongs to, and in order to have this be sort of a system one process, it's timed so that a whole list of I think it was 26 words had to be categorized within a 30-second time limit. And then instead of measuring reaction times on the paper IAT, we measure the number of mistakes you make in a limited time. And then finally, in order to measure licensing behavior, we had participants hand in their paper questionnaires to two tutors in the lecture, the module. One of the tutors is male and the other tutor is female. They were positioned at two sides of the exit to the lecture theater, and students were handing in to either the male or the female tutor under the information that the tutor they handed it into would have to tally the booklet that handed it into them. So you're generating a little bit of extra busy work for the tutor that you handed into. And we take handing in this busy work to the female tutor as potential revelation of gender bias against women. I'm running low on time, so skip over how we score the responses. We find that across the congruent and incongruent conditions, the subjects typically are getting a little bit better at categorizing these things as they go, but in fact making a little bit more mistakes. We find when we look at the percentiles in the distribution of bias scores that for both women and men, they're just as biased on average in the computer test as they are in the paper test, and this doesn't depend on whether or not they find out about their own bias. What we do find, however, is that women who receive information about their bias in the computer test make much more effort to change how biased they are in the paper test. So whereas there's a small positive correlation for men in both conditions between the computer and the paper bias tests, there is a negative correlation for women who find out what their bias was in the computer test, whereas there's not for women who do not find out what their bias was. And then the final result, which I'd like to highlight, is that women who receive feedback about their own bias are much more likely to hand their paper back to the female tutor, and this is highly significant. That the women who think that they have a chance to redeem themselves then unredeem themselves by generating more work for the female tutor, and this has a little bit of a correlation with their with how much they improve their bias between the computer and the paper tests, but that's not super significant. So we would conclude that revealing gender bias has relatively low potential for really changing people's biases, that it really only seems to affect women, and that there's potential licensing behavior that follows. So I recognize that I'm a little bit over time, and I'd like to thank you all for listening, and we will take it to the next presentation.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, so next presenter is Rosa. So Rosa, when you're ready, feel free to go ahead.
Okay, great. Can you see the slides?
Stephen, we can still see your slide. Can you stop sharing?
Yeah, I'm trying to unshare it, but my computer's still being super slow.
Yeah.
Tell you what, I will let me force quit my Teams app, and then I'll sign back on.
No. So now I can see Rosa's presentation.
Oh, great. Okay.
Now you can see them. Okay, I can see them, but not in Teams, not in Microsoft Teams. But if you can see them, that's great. Okay, so let me start. First, thanks a lot to the organizers for including me in the program, because it's not. Hello.
So Rosa, we can see only part of your slide. Okay. I'm not sure why.
And now?
Yeah, I can see your screen, but I think when you make a full screen, I think we can see only part of your slide. Can you try once more?
Let me do it again.
Please?
Yes.
It's oh, okay. Sorry. Now Stephen's slide came back.
Okay, because I removed mine. That's why I think.
Okay.
Now?
Yes, I can see.
The entire slide or just part?
I can see the whole screen.
The whole screen.